Professor Paul Midford of the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, speaking about the EU-Japan partnership in the shadow of China, introducing this new book, which you see on the table in front of him, edited with Axel Barkowski, Christopher W. Hughes, and Mary Soderberg. Particularly good time to be focusing on this issue with the EPA between the EU and Japan coming into force, and also with Chancellor Merkel just visiting over the last few days. So interesting times for Japan-European relations. And with that, I'll pass over to our speaker.
Okay. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. So I was hoping to have actually some flyers to hand out. Actually, Rutledge supposedly sent them by courier, but they didn't arrive in time, so I'm sure when I get back to Osaka, they'll be there waiting for me. But there's a copy of the book, so you can see it's actually a real book. I'm not making it up. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to talk about a little bit first about the overall book, and then particularly about my chapter and a particular argument that I make in this book. And just a little bit of background about the book, and then maybe also about the relationship. First, the book is, it talks about this in the preface, but it's really the fruit of this network that was established just over 10 years ago in Europe. Was established by Marie Soderberg, one of the co-editors at the Stockholm School of Economics, and it's known as the European Japan Advanced Research Network, or EJARN, or in Kansai it might be known as EJAN. But the idea of this network is to get Japan back on the European agenda. Around that time, in the first couple of years of this century, there was an overwhelming focus on China, which makes sense. China's a rising power. There should be a focus on China. But there was also a sense that maybe Japan had been somewhat neglected and maybe needed to have more, there needed to be more of a focus on Japan. So we're a group of Japanologists based in Europe. I mean, not all Europeans, I'm an American, who do policy-relevant research in politics and economics and some other fields as well. And we wanted to get Japan back on the agenda. And that maybe then relates back to kind of the a few basic aspects of the relationship I want to start off by talking about. Of course, during the Cold War, the relationship was overwhelmingly an economic one, and not a very always altogether smooth economic relationship. The European community, or the European community was, of course, started off as an economic entity and gradually became more political. Japan at that time, of course, itself focused more on economics than anything. There were a lot of trade frictions between the two sides and very little political interaction. But then at the end of the Cold War, things began to change very substantially. Particularly, you have the 1991 Hague Declaration, in which the EU and Japan importantly observed that both sides shared common values, and that recognition that they had common values and that they had a lot of things in common in terms of values, in terms of politics, being liberal democracies, represented a real turning point. Also in the sense that Japan began to take the European community, the EC, soon to be the EU, more seriously. And then 10 years later, we have another turning point, which is the 10-year action plan for EU-Japan that was signed in September 2001, which called for cooperation across a wide variety of fields: culture, economics, science and technology, and security as well. So it's very ambitious, very large document. But what happened was very little of the action plan was actually put into action. It ended up being more words than actual substance, which is unfortunately not uncommon with EU policies and documents. And then as the 10-year action plan was nearing its end, EJARN, which was founded, as I said, in 2008, started talking to the Commission about ways in which we could maybe re-energize the relationship or come up with a more productive next stage that didn't focus on everything, but focused on some specific areas where concrete progress could be made. We started highlighting some of these, the progress, and also just in terms of what we're really talking about here, which is the Economic Partnership Agreement, the EPA, and the Strategic Partnership Agreement that was signed last year, and the EPA just went into force on Friday. These are really the fruits of that period in the sense that, okay, the partnership agreement or the strategic action plan has expired, so what do we do next, was the question. And one important, if you read the press these days, it focuses on the short term, you might get the impression that this is all thanks to Donald Trump and kind of reaction to Donald Trump. And in some sense it is, but it's also the real, an important catalyst that's worth mentioning, besides just the desire of the two sides to do something, is actually South Korea. Because Korea and the EU had signed an economic partnership agreement and a strategic partnership agreement around 2008, and it was going into effect. And Japan was very keen at that time to conclude an economic partnership agreement because competition between Japanese manufacturers and Korean manufacturers now is not really about technology, it's mostly about price. And so suddenly Korean goods automobiles and electronics were getting in with little or no import tariffs into the EU, whereas Japan still faced those, so that put Japanese companies at a big disadvantage. European companies, on the other hand, had some real skepticism. I mean, when we went to some of the Commission hearings on what to do with the relationship moving forward, you had, for example, the European Automobile Association expressing real skepticism about whether Japan's non-tariff barriers could be lowered effectively so that they could get real market access. And you also had other concerns. Particularly, I remember the European Supermarket Association, which was arguing that European, food could not be sold in Japan. As you might know, 15 years ago, Carrefour was here before they sold out their supermarket chains. But a lot of one reason they gave up on Japan is because a lot of the food that they sell in Europe, cheeses and other things, were not allowed to be sold in Japan because they didn't, they had ingredients that were illegal under Japanese law. And so they were arguing that unless Japan decides to, let in any product that the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, deems as safe, then they shouldn't, then they couldn't really support moving forward within EPA. So then the process started around 2011 or so, 2012, and really concluded last year. And they came up with some very kind of innovative ways to deal with these issues, such as so-called scoping exercises, where they would take a market like automobile parts or something else and would try to lower non-tariff barriers and then see what the results were. They also formed a whole monitoring process, too, to kind of see how the agreement is implemented. But in terms of dealing with Japan's non-tariff barriers, this is a very ambitious agreement. So, but in any case, getting back to our book. So our book, we're also focusing on the so-called crisis of liberalism. The title talks about the rise of China, illiberal China, as a challenge to liberalism. We don't use Trump in the title, but that's obviously another part of the story. And so then our central hypothesis then is that there is this great untapped potential in EU-Japan cooperation, and together these two liberal actors have potentially can uphold the liberal order in the shadow of China and the absence of U.S. leadership. As I say, I think it's timely because of the new agreements that just went into effect. And essentially, our book examines the potential also for these two agreements. When we were finishing up the book, the agreements were pretty much already finished, so we have some ability to analyze their results. So. Now that's the kind of overview of the book. Now I'm going to switch now and talk mostly about my chapter, although I can answer some questions about the broader relationship later if you'd like. So I look at Abe's proactive pacifism and his values diplomacy. Now, in English, proactive pacifism is often translated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as proactive contributions to peace. But the original term is actually proactive pacifism. And then, of course, values diplomacy, I think, is a little bit more straightforward. And the question of, on the surface, these concepts seem to be very promising basis for expanding EU-Japan political and security cooperation, which is what the SPA calls for and mandates. In fact, I should point out, the SPA is the first time Japan has concluded a, quote, binding political and security cooperation agreement with any other country, accepting alliances such as with the United States. So this is something new for Japan, but whether being binding means it actually leads to any change or not is another question. But I look at this in the area of post-conflict peace building, promoting liberal democratic values in aid policy, which is what Japan is committed to doing, promoting the rule of law, and then look at the implications for EU-Japan cooperation. So turning to proactive pacifism, the term originates with the Norwegian peace researcher Johan Galtung and his idea of positive peace. I won't spend too much time on that, but he's aware that it's based on his term, and he's actually been a little bit critical about that. But so this was developed as a Japanese foreign policy concept around 2009 by the Japan International Forum and a scholar there, a retired diplomat, actually, Ito Kenichi. And this was adopted by Abe after he returned to the premiership. And of course, it's essentially a critique of Japan's post-war pacifism and so-called one-country pacifism, and sort of this idea that Japan professes peace but then doesn't make any contribution internationally to realize that. And then there's this implication that Japan under Abe is now shifting towards making more of an active contribution to global peace, one that includes possible use of force by SDF. Critics have even called this sort of a code word for actually using force, which I think is an exaggeration, but that gives you an idea of some of the controversy this provoked. Now, looking at peace building, this could be a potentially promising area for EU-Japan cooperation, yet, and this is kind of my critique I make of Abe in this chapter of the Abe administration's approach, actually what they really end up pursuing is not proactive pacifism, but more like passive pacifism. And particularly in compared with previous DPJ governments, the Abe administration entered office with Japan, the SDF deployed to 3 overseas UN peacekeeping operation missions. Perhaps, I believe that's the largest number Japan has ever engaged in at one time. And by 2017, Japan was down to PKO 0, essentially for the first time since 1992, in a quarter of a century. Now, Abe has started, by comparison, no new overseas SDF missions and ended all of these 3. I'll talk more a bit about that later. Now, of course, there's some missions that are continuing. There's the counter-piracy deployment off of Somalia, although Abe has actually scaled that one back as well. Then there have been some disaster relief deployments. One of Japan's largest overseas disaster relief deployments was in 2013 after the Hurricane Haiyan in the Philippines. That's interesting, but that's not the same thing as peace building. And actually, since Haiyan, the SDF has not been very active in overseas disaster relief. However, as you might have seen in the news in the past week or so, Japan, the Abe administration, might now be considering a very small deployment to the Sinai Peninsula. That actually would be significant, and it would be the first time that Japan participates in a peacekeeping mission that does not have an explicit United Nations framework. On the other hand, you can't really consider it boots on the ground, as it would be maybe 3 or 4 officers assigned to the headquarters in the Sinai. So the bottom line for all of this is no boots on the ground. That's where the Abe administration has been heading. There are also, I think, 2 officers still in Sudan, South Sudan, in the headquarters office, but again, not really a kind of boots on the ground, out in the field playing a kind of active grassroots concrete role. Now, he's also passed up other opportunities, I think that's important to note as well, to participate in meaningful non-combat missions that contribute to global security. You've had the deployment of the SDF. You could have had, but did not have, the deployment of the SDF to West Africa to combat Ebola, even as countries like the US, the UK, and even China were sending their militaries there for just that point. You could have perhaps had a deployment of the SDF to Mali for reconstruction and development missions, particularly in cooperation with the EU, because there's a so-called CSDP, a Common Security and Defense Program mission the EU is running in Somalia to try to stabilize that country. However, there has been some technical assistance and funding for the CSDP mission in Mali and also in Central Africa and Congo. You could have had, now this admittedly looks much less realistic today than it did a few years ago, you could have had an SDF and Coast Guard mission to help deal with the Mediterranean refugee crisis, which might also be very useful for Japan's own national interest, because there's been a lot of discussion over the years about if you ever have a North Korean collapse, you might have a lot of refugees flowing to Japan, similar to what you've had in the Mediterranean, and would, Japan could use the experience and also maybe use reciprocal help from the EU in that case. Now, of course, the background to this is that the Abe administration has been more interested in reinterpreting the Constitution and has been interested in expanding the rules of engagement for its peacekeepers. So my kind of take is that the reason Abe continued the South Sudan mission until May 2017 is so that he could set a new legal precedent under the new security legislation that was approved in late 2015 to allow the SDF to engage in new and expanded missions, particularly the right to come to the aid of other peacekeeping units that come under attack. Kaketsuke keigo is the term. So he tried to establish that framework, or that legal precedent, but actually if you look at the rules of engagement that were finally enacted, they were still very conservative. It would have been very hard for the SDF actually to have come to the assistance of other PKO forces, UN peacekeepers who came under attack, and in fact supposedly once they were asked to do so and they refused. But he was at least trying to establish some kind of legal precedent for that. But the thing to keep in mind is that there's a lot that Japan can do in UN peacekeeping that has nothing to do with expanding its rules of engagement or getting involved in use of force. And as I point out in the book, there are 16 ongoing UN peacekeeping missions currently that could use new personnel, contributions from Japan. So this is definitely a decision to pull back from some of these. There are a variety of reasons why you might be doing that. Some argue this is kind of anzen unten, or safe driving, creating a domestic environment for for actually revising the Constitution. We can talk more about that later. And then we turn to values diplomacy. Now, this is the successor to the geographically based Arc of Freedom that then Foreign Minister Taro Aso announced in 2006. And the Arc of Freedom, of course, was this geographically shaped to contain China's stretching from Northeast Asia through Southeast Asia into Central Asia, surrounding China. But of course, not only did it surround China, but it included some regimes that were not very liberal, that really didn't share common liberal democratic values. Now, we've moved away from that, so values diplomacy now, of course, no longer has this kind of strong geographical component, but it still essentially appears to be aimed at containing China. It's also important to note that this was a real departure from Japan's kind of traditional Cold War era kind of regional security theory, which I like to call developmentalism, which is the idea, kind of this very basic liberal idea that through material progress and economic development, East Asia will become more stable, more peaceful, and security will be enhanced. In some sense, the rise of China in the early 1990s began to kind of puncture this liberal optimism. And of course, values diplomacy is then taking that and adding this other liberal layer, which is the common values of liberal democracy, human rights, and rule of law, which of course is what the EU stands for as well, and would seem to be a very promising basis for cooperation. But as I argue, it actually hasn't entirely worked out that way. I can go into more details in the Q&A, but in 2013, Prime Minister Abe in his Jakarta speech emphasized promoting universal values such as freedom, democracy, basic human rights, again, these values diplomacy, and Japan's economic assistance, its official development assistance, its ODA charters, since 1992 have been promoting democratization and emphasizing the situation regarding the securing of basic human rights and freedoms in the recipient country. But Japan's actual track record, even before Abe, but certainly continuing under Abe and under values diplomacy, shows very little evidence of that. So the 4 least democratic and liberal countries in ASEAN have received the highest per capita aid from Japan, and 80% of all aid disbursements to ASEAN, including been to ASEAN countries like Vietnam, where their human rights record has been no better than China, and has worsened actually as Japanese aid tripled between 2008 and 2011. Cambodia and Laos, also major recipients of aid, have also seen no progress and seen backsliding. I should add that this is also based on another chapter in the book by Andre Asplund, who looks at this in great detail. He also says that there's also, to be fair, there's some evidence that the EU doesn't always uphold its claims to promoting universal values, whereas Japan tends to link aid to respect for human rights and democracy. The EU tends to link its trade agreements in that way, but not always very consistently. Zimbabwe is kind of an interesting case too. Prime Minister Abe hosted the former, then current President Robert Mugabe twice in 2016 and 2017, very close together. Of course, this is one of the most illiberal regimes in Africa with one of the worst human rights records. And at each time Mugabe visited, he offered fairly significant aid packages to Zimbabwe. And this appears to reflect this goal of counteracting Chinese influence and competing with China in Zimbabwe and Africa. And this reflects a more general kind of competition mentality that you can see with Abe and other conservatives in Japan. A competition mentality, and I can go into more detail about this later, that really thinks that liberal values don't matter. The competition with China, liberal values aren't important. What's important is just the competition. If China gives money to Zimbabwe, we should give money to them too, regardless of their human rights. Now, of course, there are other reasons too. This is also an attempt to enlist Zimbabwe's support for Japan's quest for a permanent UN Security Council seat, even though that hardly seems a likely prospect. Now, let's talk about the rule of law. And again, I'll go over this very briefly to leave more time for questions, but I'd be happy to, I have some extra slides I can bring up to talk about this later. The Abe administration has been emphasizing support for rule of law. This is almost like a mantra that they repeat. Japan supports rules-based international system, rule of law, particularly in the maritime sphere, and of course, we know what they're referring to. They're referring to the Senkaku Island dispute, EEZ disputes with China in the East China Sea, and then they're also talking about the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Now, special emphasis has been placed on these maritime conflicts, and particularly on the inadmissibility of changing the status quo through the use of force. And that is undoubtedly and clearly a common value that Japan shares with the EU. However, it's unclear whether Japan and the EU always share a common understanding of maritime law. There's some doubts there. In some ways, Japan's understanding of maritime law actually sometimes seems closer to China's actually. I'll give you one example. Foreign naval and intelligence activities in exclusive economic zones, EEZs. UNCLOS allows foreign naval activities in EEZs as long as these activities are not hostile to the littoral state. Now, the U.S. and many other Western states define intelligence gathering as non-hostile. It's important to point out also that It may also depend on the type of intelligence gathering. Intelligence gathering is not always just passive recipient of signals. Sometimes it includes sending out electronic signals, pinging radars, testing coastal defenses. It sometimes can even disrupt cell phone communications or radio communications on land in some cases. But others, of course, are simply passive recipient of signals intelligence. Now, a number of other states led by China have defined intelligence gathering as hostile and argue that it's illegal under UNCLOS to conduct intelligence gathering in another country's EEZ without their permission, which seems pretty unlikely. Now, although Japan is publicly sided with Western countries on this issue, in practice, it appears often to be closer to China's interpretation and those of some other Asian states, such as South Korea, who have been actually in practice rather skeptical. We may actually have an implicit regional norm about this, actually. Now, in the late 1990s, Japan was complaining about Chinese intelligence gathering and maritime surveys in Japan's claimed EEZ. Now, the two countries solved this issue by setting up a bilateral notification regime, which was erected, based on their shared interpretation of UNCLOS. Now, of course, if the two sides agree, why not? Who can object? Except that this is actually based on an understanding of UNCLOS that's quite different from particularly what the U.S. believes, which is the U.S. position is you can freely do these surveys in EEZs, especially if they have a military component. Now later, particularly you can do this in areas of EEZs that are in conflict between two countries. Either side has the right to do a scientific survey in an area of EEZ where there's a conflict. Now, Japan also asserted the right to carry out a survey in a disputed EEZ area disputed with South Korea. Although it backed down when Seoul threatened to seize Japanese Coast Guard vessels in 2006. And at that time, also the U.S. intervened somewhat and suggested to South Korea and to Japan that that they could both do these surveys, but there was not agreement there. And then most dramatically, Japan's Coast Guard chased a North Korean intelligence ship that it discovered in Japan's EEZ into China's EEZ, and after a firefight, not clear exactly why the North Korean ship sunk. Many believe the North Korean ship blew itself up. But this is quite interesting. In fact, this is, I think, the only case in the history of UNCLOS where a spy ship discovered in another country's EEZ has been chased and been, in some sense, attacked or engaged in a firefight with the littoral state. Now, clearly, this clashes with the U.S. assertions of its right to operate intelligence ships in other countries' EEZs, like China's. And just after this confrontation, interestingly, Prime Minister Koizumi suggested he wanted to introduce legislation banning foreign intelligence gathering in Japan's EEZ. Now, interestingly, he made that statement and then never repeated it. Either because he got a call from Washington or someone at Gaimusho said they called him and told him he couldn't do that. But I think this does point out that there is this kind of, implicitly Japan has very skeptical about foreign intelligence gathering operations in its EEZ. Again, I can talk more about that later. So just to sum up, it's hard to argue that Abe's proactive pacifism offers a really solid basis or opportunity for greater EU-Japan security cooperation based on shared liberal values, proactive pacifism, or values diplomacy. Now, there's kind of a counter, kind of cynical argument that you can make, which is the EU and the US and Japan are retreating from liberal values themselves, actually. So future cooperation might be based more on illiberal values rather than liberal values. We can see, I don't talk about that, but there's some criticism that Japan, in terms of freedom of the press and some other areas, becoming more illiberal under Abe. There's some very clear illiberal trends, obviously in the US and Europe as well. So maybe they will converge in the future around common illiberal values. Problem with that, of course, is that that would tend to attenuate the values distinction between illiberal China and Russia. So that would be, in terms of, that would make it kind of a problematic basis for cooperation. Now, Abe's proactive pacifism and his values diplomacy could also plausibly be described as liberal clothing for a realist theory. Also, and it may be a very reasonable realist strategy for containing China. So from a realist point of view, it may be perfectly reasonable. The problem is this is not a good basis for cooperation with Europe, given that there are significant interest gaps when it comes to China and also Russia between the EU and Japan. So if you just focus on narrow national and strategic interest of the two actors, there's not a really good basis for cooperation. If there's going to be cooperation between the two in global security, it really has to be based on liberal values. Otherwise, the basis isn't really there. And with that, I'll end. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Hi, good evening. Sorry, I'm a bit tall. My name is Andrea Marinkovic. I'm actually writing my thesis on this, so if I may, I have two questions, really quick. The first one is, it's common practice for the European Union to have a political clause linking the EPA and the SPA, but in the case of Japan, that's missing. In all other cases, even with Canada and Korea, it's there, so why would you argue this is the case? And the second one would be, do you think that the differences in the basic stances on geopolitical issues relating to China and Russia are creating a problem for basically cooperation between the European Union and Japan on their key issues? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Yes, the clause linking the political and the economic agreements. I think that, of course, reflects. I think this has been talked about in the press, but I think that reflects a very strong Japanese opposition to the idea of this linkage, particularly the idea that it might be linked to possible human rights violations in Japan. Even though I think that was not really. The EU didn't really expect that, but as you point out, this is a clause in many of the agreements. So Japan, I think it was taken out simply because Japan was skillful at negotiating it out. When I'm talking about cooperation, the level of cooperation I'm talking about is not something that would invoke this kind of clause anyway. I mean, the question is, will we see more EU-Japan cooperation? I might just say a little bit more about that. Again, apart from the examples I mentioned, there's also a proposal that an agreement be concluded between Japan and the EU, which would allow the regular participation and establish the rules for participation for the SDF and for civilians in European cooperative CSDP missions, security and defense program missions, such as in Mali. That is not making much progress. The Japanese side is kind of dragging its feet on that and doesn't seem to be that interested, perhaps because it seems too risky to them. Or the Abe administration, again, is really kind of pulling back from engagement in global security. On your second question, yes, what you asked is essentially what I was concluding, that there are very basic differences between the EU and Japan and how they look at global security. Japan sees China as a primary threat to itself, whereas the EU tends to focus more on Russia. Japan, on the other hand, has a remarkably relaxed view of a potential Russian threat. Whereas for the EU, although China may be seeming to become a bit more of a threat in terms of cyber, maybe space, espionage, there may be common threat perceptions in those three domains may be narrowing. But in terms of military security, China just doesn't look like a threat to the EU. It's just too far away geographically, too isolated. So you may have some convergence in cyberspace and maybe those areas especially, but in terms of military security, no. The gaps, the China gaps, the Russia gaps are really impeding, wider security cooperation.
My name is Sri Chuada, Heisei International University. Thank you very much for very comprehensive, sophisticated presentation. I agree with the point that the value, including the democracy, human rights, such a rule of law is a basis of the international society. However, there's another aspect is we should face power. Are you saying that that value diplomacy can prevent this the Chinese expansion in the South China Sea? This is my question. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. Well, clearly, liberal values cannot stop Chinese expansion in the South China Sea. So again, that may be a perfectly reasonable for the Abe administration to emphasize kind of a more realist strategy focused on power. But in terms of more global security issues, beyond, say, the South China Sea, if there's going to be cooperation, it really has to be more, I think, on a shared liberal, the basis of shared liberal values. I'm thinking of places like East Africa, for example, UN peacekeeping missions, maybe some places also even in the Indian Sea region where, for example, the EU and Japan in the past, until very recently, frankly, until the Abe administration, have been somewhat much more active in terms of deploying boots on the ground and in terms of working to deal with various regional conflicts before they spin out of control. And while everybody now is focusing on China, and maybe rightly so, we should remember that there are other global threats out there besides Russia and China. It's only 18 years since the 9/11 attacks, and those really, in no small part, emerged from the fact that you had this small civil war, this regional conflict going on in Afghanistan that was left unaddressed and became kind of a breeding ground then for a staging ground for these terrorist attacks because that failed state was not, in some sense, stabilized. And that remains an important task for Japan, the EU, and also the United States, if they can recognize it, to deal with. There are other, places like Somalia or Mali, which the French intervened and managed to stabilize, parts of Chad, places where, you have failed states or failing states. Yemen is obviously another, and Syria, of course, are another major examples where if you don't stabilize those states, those may become pose threats to advanced countries, Europe and Japan. I mean, terrorism is one. Somalia also illustrates another, piracy, right? Somali pirates started to directly threaten the sea lanes of communication upon which major industrial advanced economies in Europe and Japan depend on. So that suggests that you need more activism. And I also just want to point out, this also brings up another point I forgot to mention. The Abe administration, if you read the 2013 security strategy, it very clearly says Japan will be more active in terms of global security, more active in peacekeeping operations. But in fact, they've done exactly the opposite. In fact, you can argue that under Abe, Japanese grand strategy is deglobalizing. It's moving back more towards a regional focus and even towards territorial defense of Japan, which was the kind of Cold War equilibrium of Japanese defense policy. Which, again, in some sense is reasonable. You have this direct threat to the Senkaku Islands. So just as Japan felt its territory was threatened in Hokkaido by the Soviets, now they feel threatened by China and the Senkakus. But still, that's the result is kind of deglobalization, pulling back from global security cooperation.
Ken Moskowitz here at Temple University. Wondering if you could address what the trip to London, Abe's trip to London meant, what he was trying to achieve there in terms of what he's trying to achieve in Europe overall. Thank you.
Okay, I don't think I have too much of detail to say about the trip to London, but I would make a few observations. Obviously, it has a lot to do with Brexit, trying to secure some kind of Brexit deal or some kind of arrangement that preserves the investments the large-scale investments that UK companies have made, or that Japanese companies have made in the United Kingdom. Most of companies like the Nissan, who have factories in the UK, and Nissan, of course, just announced they were going to scale back some of their investment there. In terms of security, of course, you have had a growing security cooperation between the UK and Japan. We had, for the first time in the, really since the end of World War II, you had British military units, particularly Air Force units, flying to Japan and conducting joint military exercises on Japanese soil. So a kind of broader trend, not really talked about in this book, although this is kind of an example, is Japan's kind of decentering away from exclusive dependence and focus on the U.S. as its own sole security partner. It's now beginning to increasingly engage other security partners. So during the Cold War, the Japanese military would only exercise with the U.S. and nobody else. Now that's changing with the British exercises with the SDF in Japan. We've had the French come over for naval exercises. The Indians have come to Japan for naval exercises. This is something very new. But again, back to your question, I think that's another important point that Abe wants to develop. He wants to develop military cooperation with the British, more joint exercises. He's happy when the British talk about sailing their vessels to the South China Sea. He would like them maybe to engage in a freedom of navigations operation. Of course, we had a British defense minister recently make this kind of quixotic suggestion that the UK, after Brexit, was going to put a military base in Southeast Asia and another one in the Caribbean, I guess to counterbalance the two other superpowers from their perspective. But certainly from Abe's perspective, any kind of engagement like that in the South China Sea and East Asia by the British would be welcome, and I think he is trying to encourage that.
Siegfried Knittel, freelancer from Germany. You said China is too far for the EU, but I think there are different views in European countries about this. UK has really interest in engaged in dealing with the South China Sea. France also, because France has still a colony in the South Pacific. So in this way, Germany is not interested in dealing much with China in a military way, but UK and France has a different policy in this way, I would say. And then the other point about Abe's engagement in peacekeeping operation. I think for him it's the most important thing to show a kind of engagement, but he fears any kind of a casualties. I think that he thinks he wants to in the long run to the normal Japanese state also participating in military action. But if there is some casualty in the next years, it would destroy all this plan for participating in military actions.
Okay, thank you for those two comments, those very thoughtful comments. It's certainly true that different European countries have different views about how to view China's rise as a military power, but I would say no European country, even Britain or France, views China as the same kind of threat that Japan does. They may be more concerned about China in the South China Sea than, say, Germany or Spain, but not nearly as concerned as Japan is, particularly about what's going on in the East China Sea. So I think even with those countries, there is, of course, a gap. Now, of course, if freedom of navigation were to become an issue, then you'd, of course, have increased European concern. But there's no indication, honestly, that that is an issue. I mean, the Chinese are very opposed to intelligence gathering in the South China Sea, but there's no evidence so far that they're trying to interfere with freedom of commercial navigation, and even passage of naval ships they don't object to as long as they don't come within what they define as the territorial waters of the geographical features that they hold. Now, as for the other question, I think you're right, of course, that Japan, Abe and Japan in general is very sensitive about the idea of suffering military casualties in peacekeeping. and other overseas deployments of the SDF. But of course, this has been true from the beginning. This was true from 1995 when the SDF first went overseas to Cambodia to participate in UN peacekeeping. Now, no Japanese SDF members were killed then, but police officer was killed. Japanese police officer was killed in Cambodia. So there were some casualties on that there. But it's remarkable, actually, if you look at the SDF, all of their UN peacekeeping operations overseas from 1992 to 2017, they suffered not a single casualty. Now, there are some, if you look closely, there are some reasons. There's some indications that when they sent the SDF into Eastern Zaire, they talked to Mobutu, and, there may have been some financial contributions that kind of helped that process. You can maybe see a bit of that in South Iraq as well. They've tried very hard to make sure that no one would have an interest in attacking them. Of course, when they go overseas, they engage in non-combat engineering projects, rebuilding water, rebuilding schools, purifying water, doing all kinds of development projects, things that really nobody can object to, but which are also really important and valuable. But despite that, throughout all of that 25 years, Japan has undertaken the risk, has exposed itself to the risk of suffering casualties. So the question is, why was the DPJ willing to take that risk with 3 missions, and Abe now is at 0 missions? Now, one answer to that, which maybe you were hinting at, is constitutional reform. And I mentioned this idea of, safe driving, the idea that Abe doesn't want to have any casualties, particularly now, because if he was to achieve constitutional revision, if that was that process really got started, suffering casualties overseas could really derail that. However, as we, I think, know from as of last month, Abe has essentially given up on constitutional revision while he's prime minister. He said in January that he's not prioritizing realizing constitutional reform by 2020, by next year. He didn't really emphasize it in his Diet speech. So, it could be now that he's de-emphasizing or no longer aiming at constitutional revision while he's prime minister, that maybe he will become more active in one of these missions. Maybe he will become less casualty averse. And I'd also point out that I think in the longer run, actually, Abe is maybe not so opposed to casualties, in the sense that I think he thinks that for Japan to reemerge as a quote-unquote normal military power, it has to be willing to accept casualties, and it has to go through that process. But it's hard for him as prime minister because, of course, the short-term costs for him and for his project of constitutional revision would be very high.
Hello, my name is Anna Dekeling. I'm a graduate school student at Waseda University. I would like to go a bit in the same direction, but also what you've been talking about the way of Japan being able to engage in post-conflict rebuilding, for example, when it comes to failing states, because obviously Japan is highly engaged when it comes to capacity building and non-combat things, but there's a lot of more ways on how Japan would be able to engage. So is there any suggestions or anything that you would like to add to that?
I would just say that, yes, Japan has been emphasizing much more capacity building. It's been shifting its emphasis towards that direction. And that's important and useful. And, we shouldn't shortchange that. Japan has been making financial and technical contributions as well. Those are all very important and welcome. But there's also this issue of being willing to undertake some risk, and being willing, as was commonly said, put boots on the ground. We've sort of come full circle. I mean, during the first Gulf crisis, Japan was criticized for only making financial contributions, maybe contributions in kind, but not being willing to put boots on the ground in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. And conservative politicians like Abe criticized this and said, that's wrong, we can't let that happen, we have to put boots on the ground. And now we're at the point where, for many of these same politicians or their successors, boots on the ground is something they no longer want to talk about. they now want to move away from that, and they want to say, no, we're doing capacity building, so that's fine. But I think you could, but other countries, whether it's these 16 peacekeeping missions or other things like the Ebola epidemic in West Africa or some other places, other countries do put boots on the ground. And you can argue that Japan should too, particularly since Japan was relatively late coming to peacekeeping in the first place. And it's been one of the most important, UN peacekeeping has been a really important mechanism or framework for Japan to contribute to global security. That said, I mean, one can certainly say that the new, the security law from 2015 that makes it easier for Japan to participate in non-UN peacekeeping frameworks like the Sinai peacekeeping mission is a welcome thing. And, if Japan was contributing more substantially in that area, I think that would be just as good.
My name is Michimi Muranushi. I'm teaching international politics at Gakushin University in Tokyo. Your comments on Zimbabwe and Cambodia interested me most. I think my question is, given the illiberal conditions in those countries, how can a country like Japan compete with China effectively? I think, I don't know much about Zimbabwe, but Japan gave a lot of money to Cambodia, but China dominates it now. So is there any chance that by competing with China in such dimensions and giving a lot of money competitively with China, Japan might eventually win?
I think I would be kind of skeptical of that. I mean, of course, the basic position, certainly that other Western countries take, is that if it's an illiberal regime, you should not engage with them. Now, that's an interesting point. I mean, if you give an illiberal regime more aid, will they eventually change? Maybe not. Now, again, you might decide, again, like in the case of Cambodia, that it doesn't matter whether they become more liberal or not. What matters are other values like security, competition with China. But this gets back to the realism versus liberal values part. But I certainly have never seen, and maybe you or someone else can make a coherent argument or case for why kind of giving a lot of economic aid to an illiberal regime, an authoritarian dictatorship, could result in meaningful change towards a more liberal system, would lead to more respect for human rights. Now, of course, it's obviously carrots matter as well as sticks, so maybe you could make a case for that, but that doesn't seem to be what's motivating the strategy. It seems to be motivated more by we're not going to pay that much attention to human rights violations in Cambodia or Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Masahiro Monga at Keio University. I'm teaching Japanese politics. I have two questions. The first one is the image of Prime Minister Abe. When Prime Minister Abe came to office in 2012, the reception of Japanologists and the Western media are not very happy with him. Actually, some of them are making an outcry of the hard right groups are re-emerging or something like that. And for Abe, the so-called right-wing people in Japanese context has been a core supporter of Mr. Abe, and Mr. Abe took care of them very well. Given these sequences, I'm wondering to what extent Abe could establish his profile as a protector of liberalism in the international arena. The second question is about the declining power of Japan, in particular economy. Obviously, Japan is declining in terms of economy in particular, and I wonder to what extent Japan is capable of maintaining its power in the security field as a global power. Thank you very much.
Okay, on the first question, it's interesting you mentioned that there was a lot of opposition to Abe. I think it was a year or so ago when I was in Tokyo. Somebody, actually a Japanese scholar, asked me, why do all American scholars support Abe? And why are they never critical? And I don't have an answer to that. Obviously, I'm somewhat critical. But he certainly in Washington, I think, is very well liked by and by many academics in the U.S. There's a very positive image of Abe, maybe partly because he's been doing things that seem to be consistent with American national interests. Can he be seen as a protector of liberalism? Well, I mean, the competition has gotten a lot easier. So in the era of Donald Trump, he can look pretty liberal, and certainly he is defending certain aspects of the liberal international order. He's defending the open international trade order. And although they're not nearly as liberal, though, I mean, that's other states, even China to some extent, are doing that as well. So that's not maybe a very high bar, but certainly in terms of international trade and economic openness, I think Abe can enjoy that image and arguably does. But as I'm suggesting in my talk, in other areas, it's harder for Abe to kind of have that image because the policies Japan is pursuing are not necessarily that liberal. I think that's a fundamental problem. And I didn't talk about this so much, but there are, let's be clear, also some doubts about Abe and Japan domestically. We, of course, had the 2013 secrecy law. Now, to be sure, Japan needed a secrecy law. We had this Coast Guard official leaking a video on YouTube back in 2010, leaking classified information. Japan definitely needs a secrecy law, but the clause in that law that allowed for the potential prosecution of journalists for publishing secret information, that's quite illiberal. It has never been used, but arguably it's kind of hanging over the media. One might wonder when journalists publish information about, say, the recent scandal about data, labor data or something else, whether some journalists think twice about whether they could be prosecuted. Maybe that seems far-fetched, but there is some evidence that there's been a bit of cowing of the media. Certainly if you look at international rankings of Japan in terms of freedom of the press, it's fallen somewhat. So from that angle, he doesn't necessarily look that liberal. Of course, we have this problem in Japan also of weak inter-party competition, which kind of more generally, I think, raises questions sort of about Japanese democracy. But so for those reasons, I mean, Abe looks relatively liberal compared to Trump and very liberal on trade, but in other areas I think it's a very mixed picture. And I'm sorry, your second question was about Japan's declining economic power?
Economic power. Japan is declining.
Right, and what can be done about it, I think?
To what extent Japan is capable of maintaining its profile as a security power at this moment?
Well, I mean, in some sense, over the story of the past 25 years has been Japan compensating for its relative economic decline by becoming more active politically and militarily in security. And so, yes, I think it probably can maintain its profile. And after all, I mean, look, Japan's economy is how much bigger than the Russian economy? And yet Russia, nobody says today that Russia is an insignificant security actor. So I don't think Japan is having the third largest economy, even if it falls to number 4, is suddenly going to be insignificant. The Japanese economy is much bigger than the UK economy. It's bigger than the French economy. It's still bigger than the German economy. Although on the other hand, Germany is not such a major security actor perhaps, but France and Britain certainly are. So I don't think Japan's relative economic decline means it's about to become insignificant as a security actor.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Andrea Fischetti. I'm researching at the University of Tokyo and working at the Asia Pacific Initiative. I believe your argument that Japan's strategy is realist in a liberal clothing is very compelling, given Abe's pragmatism, and also given, as you said, that it's very easy for Japan now to appear as liberal. But if it's a realist strategy, you mentioned the importance of competing with China, for example, in the case of aids to Zimbabwe. What's the purpose of this strategy? Because you also mentioned it's aimed at China, but Japan cannot, I believe it's hard for Japan to financially compete with China, and also militarily. So what's the purpose of this strategy in the medium to long term?
I think I don't think they're entirely of one mind about whether they can compete with China. I think in some areas, technology, aid to foreign countries in particular, they are actively trying to compete. I think Zimbabwe is a good case in point. And I would emphasize that among conservatives in Japan, there is this competition mentality with China that sometimes doesn't seem altogether rational. Let's see, I think I have this slide here. Obviously, Zimbabwe is a case, but this is a really very interesting case. This was before the Abe administration, when we had the DPJ, we had Hatoyama in power. This was an article that was published in Yomiuri Shimbun, in which they supposedly quoted members of officials in the defense ministry as saying that if Japan stops refueling U.S. ships in the Indian Ocean, China's going to take over. Now, in terms of like amazing stories in Yomiuri Shimbun, this is number one on my list, at least for now. How anyone could possibly think that the U.S. Navy would let China do that. But I'd say this is really telling, because it says this competition mentality, even when it doesn't seem very rational, is kind of all engrossing. And also it says values don't matter. When you take this position, you're essentially saying, U.S. doesn't care about values. If China will refuel our ships, who cares if their values are different? But, you know, that's not really, I think, the world we live in entirely. Also, you used the term practical, and that, you know, Abe's strategy is practical. Yes, in some sense it is, but it's not entirely practical in the sense that, you know, focusing on common values can have real practical payoffs, and not focusing on them can have real practical costs. Again, not dealing with some of these conflicts in developing countries, places like Somalia, again Mali, in the past Aceh in Indonesia. Not dealing with those can have real security costs in the long run. So sometimes it's maybe not practical. It's not practical versus impractical, or practical versus idealistic. Sometimes it's short-term practicality versus kind of long-term practicality, or longer-term, thinking about the longer-term costs of not addressing some of these issues. And indeed, if Japan really does have liberal values domestically, in the long run, it probably will serve its interests if it can promote these overseas.
My name is Kamura, and I'm a foreign policy watcher. And I have a question about perception gap on China between Japan and Europe. So, well, the Abe is quite enthusiastic of freedom of navigation. While on the other hand, so he said that he would endorse China's plan of Belt and Road Initiative. So, but that's quite contradictory, because the Belt and Road Initiatives raise critical concerns in Europe, like hostile takeover of their businesses and infrastructure infiltration, and also, the most critically, the atomic nuclear plant in the UK. So how do Europeans see this Abe's contradiction over China? Thank you.
I mean, yes, Abe has indicated some support for the Belt and Road Initiative. I think that's true. I think he's warmed to it a bit. There's also some support, indication that behind the scenes, Japan, although not joining the AIIB, is nonetheless supporting it indirectly through the Asian Development Bank. But I don't think there's anything inconsistent between the Belt and Road Initiative on the one hand and freedom of navigation on the other. There've been a lot of media stories about, you know, as you say, maybe hostile takeover of companies in countries that are by Chinese companies in countries that are participating in Belt and Road Initiative. Talk about debt trap, etc. I honestly have not looked at that issue very closely myself. I have to say I'm a little bit skeptical of that, just because I think, you know, if countries that find themselves in a debt trap, it's because they let themselves take out too much debt. I mean, I have a colleague in Trondheim who's from Sri Lanka who told me that's very much his take, at least in the case of Sri Lanka. So I'm not sure that that really poses such a big threat, and to the extent it does, I think it can definitely be dealt with. And as for the nuclear plant in the UK, It seems that the British accept that. And of course, the UK and now Russia, and to some extent still France, are really the only major nuclear reactor firms or companies that can make nuclear reactors, build nuclear reactors that are really left. Toshiba has pulled out. Hitachi is pulled out of its plant facility, nuclear power plant in the UK. So, I mean, if you want to build a nuclear power plant today, you basically have to rely on China or Russia, maybe in combination with France. So I think the bigger question might be whether, if they stop that facility, it's probably going to be because they decide that nuclear power is simply no longer a practical technology.
Okay, so I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question that I think you make a very convincing case that Abe's commitment to liberal values is very thin, a thin veneer. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about then what is really driving his commitment to it. It doesn't seem to be domestically driven. Is it therefore simply to differentiate Japan from China? And if so, that wouldn't seem to be that convincing a strategy, since it can be so easily demonstrated that that commitment to liberal values is, on the political side at least, so superficial.
I think it may be part of what has been talked about more and more in Japan under Abe, which is kind of an information strategy, kind of a PR strategy, part of public diplomacy. He is, I think, in some sense trying to sell an image. And I wouldn't say that he isn't investing anything in the image, but not very much. And trying to do so at minimal cost and minimal risk. So I think that is essentially what it is, and he's certainly not, Abe and Japan are not the first country, the first actor that tries to project an image that's quite different from what they're actually doing. But that's I guess my take. I mean, again, I come back to the term I used, realist strategy in liberal clothing. I think that's what he's trying to do. And, to the extent that Western elites or the Western press don't focus that closely on Japan, I think maybe they can succeed in doing so. And maybe, when you look at the security strategy and it says we're going to become more active in global security, more active in peacekeeping, that's, essentially tatemai. That's projecting an image. And, I think one of our roles as scholars is to point out the difference between that and what's actually happening. And more generally, I mean, Abe has been really promoting Japan's image a lot. I mean, I think this is tied up with the Olympics and now with the 2025 Osaka Expo, and his real push to make Japan a top tourist destination, which has been very successful. So I think in terms of appealing to the sympathy and support of Western countries, in other areas he's actually been pretty successful.
Giulio Pugliese, King's College London. Thank you very much. As you know, I pretty much agree with your take. And speaking of images and strategic narratives, my question is really on the slogan, proactive contribution to peace. My understanding is that perhaps precisely because of what you said, the Japanese government have stopped utilizing it that much, right? It's probably like a year and a half or so that proactive contribution to peace apparently disappeared from the public sphere, and it has been overtaken by the free and open Indo-Pacific. Is that because they have trying to because of the inconsistency with the previous message? What do you think is the reason why they've toned down the sloganeering on proactive contribution to peace? Is it domestic? Is it foreign audiences related? So are they speaking to Trump's ears by emphasizing the free and open Indo-Pacific? Is it because they're really actually going to focus on that region, the Indo-Pacific, whatever that region is actually? And then this is a question I mentioned also earlier, but I'd like to have a sense for everybody. What are the potential avenues of real cooperation then between the European Union and Japan at the political / strategic level? What do you think these avenues are? Thank you.
Okay. Well, regarding the second question, what are the potential avenues for cooperation? I referred to this a little bit before, but I think in certain areas like cybersecurity, maybe security in outer space as well, there's more room and potential for cooperation. Europe has some growing concerns about cyber espionage, perhaps from Chinese telecom companies. That's still, I think, very much an open debate and being debated in Europe, and there's some pushback, and there's also some concern that if they don't use Chinese companies, they might not really have any other choices. Those kinds of issues, but those are areas where we can see some real cooperation, I think, and where we can see some kind of where perceptions again are coming together. In terms of the Indo-Pacific region, again, I think it's a kind of vague concept. It's too, the kind of, my cynical take is that China has outgrown the Asia-Pacific in the view of Japan and maybe the United States, and so they need a larger framework to in which to contain and kind of manage China, so they made it the Indo-Pacific. I mean, I almost wonder why don't they just call it the Euro-Pacific region? Then they can bring Europe into this as well. We could, I mean, if the Abe administration begins to, it's possible the Abe administration, or certainly after the Abe administration, which we'll probably see, in about 2 years' time, more or less, may begin to re-engage in some of these peacekeeping missions and kind of peace building missions in various parts of the world, beyond just the kind of local East Asia region. And if they do that, then there'd be more scope for cooperation. Another area I might have mentioned it already, where there could be more scope for cooperation, is if the EU and Japan can all eventually conclude this agreement on integrating the members of the SDF and civilians into EU cooperative defense and security programs in places like Mali, Congo, Niger. That would make that would be another promising area. And of course, bilaterally, there's also some important cooperation. I mentioned, UK and French military forces coming for military exercises. Then we have the whole new dimension of weapons development, where we have, since 2011, actually before Abe, already under the Noda administration, we had a significant relaxation of Japan's previous policy of effectively non-export of weapons or non-co-development of weapons with any country except for the United States. We've since that time had Japan begin to actively co-develop weapons, beginning with the United Kingdom, and more recently we've had agreements with France and Germany on co-development of various weapons. So that's another area where I think we will see more cooperation moving forward. I'm sorry, I have to admit, I forgot, can you just remind me, what's the first part of your question? Oh, it was, why do you think there is no more mentioning of practical? Oh, yes, that's right. Yeah, that's true. There is less mention of it. I guess I might like to believe it's because critics like me pointed out the inconsistency, but I'm not. I doubt that's the reason. Or maybe other critics who are listened to more pointed this out. So perhaps they are responding to foreign, maybe also domestic criticism as well, though I think probably more foreign criticism and the international image. There was some talk actually that at the end of last year, there was going to be a new security strategy issued, and that the security strategy would drop the term proactive pacifism or proactive contribution to peace. But we didn't get a new security strategy. In fact, I was basically told yesterday the main reason why we got the new Boei Taiko last year was because of concerns about cybersecurity, space security, electromagnetic spectrum, these kind of new security domains that Japan is now beginning to emphasize, and which were not emphasized in the previous TICO, and that actually the TICO is earlier than they wanted it to be, and that they issued it earlier because they wanted to emphasize these new areas. So, but for that reason, it was decided they didn't need to have a new security strategy statement, which I guess will come at some point later. But yes, it may well be that Abe is now kind of beginning, the Abe administration is beginning to bring practice and kind of declaratory policy more in line with their actual practice. I think that's probably what is happening.
Right, well, thank you all very much for your questions. I've just got a couple of closing remarks that if you're not already on our email list, but you'd like to receive future event information, then there's a basket at the front, and if you leave your business card in there, we'll add you to the email list. Also, on the wall over there, there's some posters about forthcoming events. I can make out something about paintball. Seems rather unlikely that that's an ICAS event, but there are two above it which are, I think. And with that said, just please, if you could join me in thanking our guest speaker for an excellent talk. Thank you very much.